What does loving your neighbor actually look like? This is Journey with Care, where curious Canadians get inspired to love others well through real-life stories and honest conversations. Welcome, fellow sojourners, to another episode of Journey with Care. This is Johan, along with our co-host, Wendi.
Hello, hello.
But before we get started, I wanted to mention, for those that have been enjoying Journey with Prayer, our corresponding prayer journey to every episode that we do, just to kind of take it from the head to the heart, that is on its own separate podcast feed. So you can go find that on your favorite podcast player or check the show notes, and there will be a link there for you to find it. Journey with Prayer. Make sure you go subscribe and follow that as well on your favorite podcast player. So we are in our second episode of our series, Differently Wired in Community. Wendi, you wanna kick us off on this second episode?
Yeah, we're in our series, Differently Wired in Community. Last episode, we had Pastor Corrine Thomas with us from Center Street Church in Calgary to kick off this series, Differently Wired in Community. And today we're going to keep going, diving into more stories and experiences of people differently wired. And when we talk about differently wired, we're talking about neurodiversities or disabilities, mental illness. It's going to be a wide range. We're not going so much onto labels, but looking at the exceptionalities that are within our communities, within our churches. And we want to look at how do people care differently and better together, and how can we care intentionally for those with exceptionalities. And with us today, we have a special guest, Dr. Harold Park, who also happens to be my husband and co-founder of Care Impact. Welcome to the podcast. Welcome back to the podcast.
Thank you. It's really great to be back.
So for those who do not know you, Harold, can you give a little bit about yourself and what you do?
Sure. So I'm a psychotherapist. I've been in the field of counseling for approximately 20 years. I work with individuals, couples, and families. I work with people from a very diverse background. Currently, I would say I meet with probably about 20 people a week here in Winnipeg and also online.
And tell us a little bit more about your background, what got you into counseling, and a little bit of your educational background.
Sure. So I studied for my master's, completed that 20 years ago, and then I did a doctorate in marriage and family therapy. Currently, I'm working with a psychologist here in Winnipeg, as well as two other organizations where I do online counseling and coaching.
Well, I know firsthand that you're curious, you love learning, and you have put hours upon hours upon hours, years upon years into the practice that you currently have. And most recently, you have added to your doctorate some training in some neurodiversities, being able to do assessments and things like that. Can you tell me a little bit more about that recent interest of yours?
I guess it really started from our family, where we discovered that we do have neurodiversity with our kids. And just through that journey, you and I, we've both traveled in this journey together. I've really wanted to learn more about ADHD and ASD. And so that led me to getting some professional training in these areas. And that's something that I really feel strongly about, which is just a strong family connection to the neurodiversities.
Yeah, and so for those not familiar with ASD, that would be Autism Spectrum Disorder, a superpower that we know very, very personally. And you have been able to help other people find their own diagnoses. And why is it important that as you're helping clients in your office and online, why is it important for people to discover their exceptionalities? Is it just for a label, or is there something more?
Well, you know, when people come in to see me, oftentimes they're struggling in life in various areas. So it could be a relationship, it could be work, it could be self-care. And as we start talking, oftentimes there are symptoms that really are very much aligned to the neurodiversities of ASD and ADHD. And so as we look into those areas, then it really opens up a new lens through which a person can look at their life, and people can find strategies, tools, and resources to be able to better cope and to manage with the symptoms. And I found it very rewarding to be able to help people navigate this area because, unfortunately, sometimes these things are not discovered until later in life. And people, they say, I wish I would have been diagnosed earlier. And so oftentimes when I'm meeting with university students who are struggling with their academics, they're having a hard time focusing, they're being inattentive in their schoolwork. Through the work that we do, we're able to help them to find treatment for this. And it's very fulfilling to see that life can be better through this awareness.
Yeah, and I've heard comments from people who have received diagnosis, a sense of relief and saying, "Oh, I'm not broken. I'm just differently wired." We sometimes liken it to Apple and Android, just different functionalities and different preferences in how we go about life. And when we talk about neurodiversities, we're also not trying to put people in a particular box. The saying with autism goes, when you've met a person with autism, you've met one person with autism, meaning that everybody is still very unique. It is a spectrum. And I'd love to dive in a little bit. I know you have a lot of expertise in a lot of different diagnoses, but particularly autism today, to learn a little bit more about that. How did you come personally to learn about autism and go down that path?
Well, it all started with our son, who was having some struggles with school, with anxiety, and we brought him to an anxiety clinic here in the city. And through assessments and things like that, we discovered that he does have autism, high-functioning autism. And so it was through that discovery, which was approximately 8 years ago. I think it was about 7 years old. Through that discovery, there's a saying, the apple doesn't fall far from the tree. So we kind of looked into, actually, you kind of helped me to look within myself and look into the possibility that I may also be on the spectrum. And so that kind of led me down a journey of discovery. And through that, we were able to contact a psychiatrist who was able to provide that diagnosis.
So in getting the diagnosis, how has that helped you understand yourself as a father as well as a leader in your home, as a husband?
Well, I think the first thing, which was a struggle, was acceptance, because with any diagnosis, you're wondering if it's true, if it's not true. And there was a bit of wrestling early on. And so I had to work through that. And I think that as I was able to become more aware and more educated about ASD, and I was able to look back on my life, it really helped me to see where my struggles in life came from. And through that, I think a key part was having a level of acceptance that I'm wired a certain way. So I felt like I could have a level of acceptance. And I also knew, on the other hand, that I could grow and learn, find some strategies, be able to accommodate in certain areas. And so I think just having that combination of acceptance for who I am and the ability to know that, I'm still able to learn new strategies of parenting, of being in relationship. So I think those things have really helped me to progress as a person.
And for myself, as a wife and mother of people in my family on the autism spectrum, for me, it was helpful in the way to have better compassion and understanding on how to relate and how best to support and nurture these relationships. And I now see there's a lot I had to learn. I thought I knew what autism was. There's a classic kind of sense of that you see it in the movies or in media or a certain type of characteristics, but you don't know it until you're in it. And even then, I didn't know it until it was introduced to me by professionals. And as I explored it, I found such relief. I said, you know what? There is hope. I'm not alone. And my kids and my husband aren't alone. And there's actually strategies on how we can do things better. And I need to adjust. I need to adjust what I thought was normal so that we can accommodate. I was outnumbered in 2 biological children diagnosed on the spectrum and a husband. And I'm like, this is so foreign to me, But now I have language, now I have skills, now I can identify with others and learn some strategies to move forward in a good way. And it really was a strengthener for our family and our marriage when we came to accept and understand what it is we were dealing with. Maybe I was odd. I see such exceptionalities, beautiful things, people on the spectrum, such intelligence and such gifts and abilities and straightforwardness, no beating around the bush. There's such beautiful things that I've learned that, wow, our society would be better if we created some belonging for everyone.
Okay, so Harold, you mentioned how you were able to look back on your life after receiving that diagnosis and it helped you to understand yourself a little bit better. Do you have any of those stories that come to mind when you look back on your life? Anything that you want to share as you were reflecting on that time?
I think just looking at my entire life from elementary school up to my work experiences in my 20s, I think a common theme that I felt is I just really felt like I was on a different wavelength than a lot of other people. Like I just couldn't feel like I fit in when people were having conversations. It was hard for me to catch up on conversations within a group setting. Social interactions, I think I was very challenged with. So I didn't have friends for most of my life growing up. And so it just seemed like for me, I didn't feel a sense of belonging within the school community or within the workplace.
So, Harold, I've had some fun conversations with your mom, and we've reminisced about your childhood, and she really identified with my parenting journey, saying, it'll be okay, Wendi. I understand because I raised Harold, and he was actually harder to handle. Can you share a few stories that stand out about what was it like? You were so meek and mild. That's what everybody sees right now as this psychotherapist sitting there helping so many people and calm and mild, but that's not who you were. That's not the picture that your mom painted of you. Can you give us a glimpse of who you were as a child trying to adjust in this weird world?
Yeah, there's quite a few stories where I was, I guess, unique, I guess is one way you could call it. There was this one situation where my mom, she cut my hair and I didn't like the way she cut it. This was when I was probably about, maybe 10 years old or so. And so I really got upset. I was quite angry to the point where she had to call the police to control my behavior. So I had a hat on at the time when the police came into the living room. And I remember the police officer pulled up my cap and said, you know what, it's not that bad. And so he tried to calm me down. But I did have this rigidity with things. I just had a hard time if things were different than what I was expecting, if it was unpredictable, like a different type of haircut. I really had a hard time with that. And so that's just one story that sticks out from my childhood.
Yeah, meltdowns are a real thing. I remember your mom talking to me about it, and she did seek help, and she tried to get parenting help, psychotherapy, even back then. This is like 40, 50 years ago. And what saddened me about her story, her side of the story, was that the professionals just said, you know what, it's your parenting. And they couldn't see it for the diagnosis that it was, that she felt so bad that she wasn't doing enough. And I know that feeling as a mom, just feeling you're not doing enough when you see these meltdowns and this rigidity. But knowing what you're going through, it makes a huge difference. And there were other stories as well. I remember the story about you selling raffle tickets. You had your independent business streak in your own little world that you had crafted up. You went door to door selling raffle tickets. You want to tell about that?
Yeah, so I was really focused on having pizza, and my parents, they were busy with their business, and so oftentimes I was left at home, and so I was probably about 10 or 12 back then, and so I really wanted a pizza. I had no money, and so I was thinking, okay, how can I get enough money for a pizza? And so I thought, hey, maybe if I made these raffle tickets and I put on there that I'm giving away a TV, and I went door to door and sold these raffle tickets, maybe I can raise a few bucks to order a pizza. And so I got some paper together, cut it up, and put like on their name, address, phone number, and I said on there that I was giving away a TV. And I went door to door, and I went to this one neighbor across the street, and she said to me, "Do you have a license to do this?" And so she was pretty skeptical about the handwritten pieces of paper that I was trying to put off as tickets. So yeah, that was just one of the antics that I did when I was younger.
Well, when pizza is your hyper focus, you do what you got to do, and love the tenacity. It's so funny. Also, you didn't get introduced to church, or you weren't a part of a church till later on in life, but there was a hyper focus that connected you to a faith community that every summer they knew you would be around. Can you tell us about that hyper focus and that passion and exceptionality you had that connected you to a local church? It's not a Bible study.
Yeah, so when I was in my high school and early university years, I was connected to this church, and it was really a very loose connection. It was connection through softball. And so every summer, they would start up a softball team to play in this church league. And people in the church, they knew when I showed up in the summer, they knew, they said, "Hey, it must be softball season. Harold's here." And so I would go to the church for just a couple of months during the summer. My main objective was just to be able to, show off my ability on the field. I wasn't really focused on going to church service, but that was just really my focus back then, was to show that I could play and hit some home runs.
And obviously, it did create some kind of community for you. I know relationships had not been your strength growing up, but you did feel that you could show up there and find belonging, hitting a baseball and getting involved in the church in that way. Did that have any impact on your perception of the church or your view of God or faith? Looking back, can you see how that may have influenced, or was it strictly softball?
Well, I think looking back and looking at it through this lens that I have now, I realized that back then there was an expectation to be a certain way, to look a certain way in our youth group. At the time, I was in the high school and young adults groups, and I realized that, there was an expectation that, you kind of had to be social, you had to be interacting, and I really wasn't so good at that. The group dynamics, I really had to force myself to try to have relationships. And so that was a struggle, but I knew that because I was good at softball, I would have a level of acceptance and respect. And I felt like people accepted me because of that. And, if it wasn't for softball, I don't think I would have entered that church, because I wasn't a very social person. Social interactions were very difficult for me. And so looking back, I realized that, people who have ASD and are trying to feel a connection to a church, it could be very difficult unless there is some sort of connection point.
Yeah, and one could say, well, you don't look autistic. And people wouldn't know you are on the spectrum. Actually, most people, family and friends listening to this here on the episode, are probably not even always aware that you have this diagnosis because you don't look autistic. Have you heard that saying before? And does your experience of church is it still like that? How is your church experience today?
I think that, for the most part, in my experience, there hasn't been much change in the church environment. I know that there are some churches out there that are aware about neurodivergency, but for the most part, I think that there is a certain expectation that we do need to fit in a certain way, that there's an expectation that the leadership, they know what neurodivergent people need or want. But I think there's still a lot of ignorance and a lot of misunderstanding about being neurodivergent. And so I think there is still a need for many of us to put on this mask so that we could feel like we're actually fitting in, that we're part of the crowd, that we feel like we belong. And, when you put on a mask for so long, it can get stressful. It can get tiring. It can create depression, anxiety, a reduction in self-esteem. There's so many things that can weigh you down when you put on this mask for so long. So I think for myself, over the years, I have been putting on a mask, in various aspects of my life. But I think that in the church in particular, I think that, it has been a struggle sometimes fitting into some of the expectations that are present in the church.
So how have you done that? How have you found a way to fit into some of those expectations?
Well, I would say, with the church that we've been attending, I in particular like to sit in the back of the church, the back row. Just in terms of being in the front, I have a hard time. Just there's some anxiety. If I'm more up in the front versus in the back, I can feel more settled and more calm in the back. So that's one way. I do have a desire to connect with people, but for me, I find one-on-one is the way that I feel most comfortable. If there's several people talking in a group, I tend not to want to join in on those type of conversations. But if there's just one person, I feel like that's more my comfort zone.
I'm going to go back to when you talked about how having that connection point is what actually got you in the church. Not every person on the spectrum is going to like baseball as their connection point. So how does church create those connection points for others on the spectrum to be able to come into the church, not knowing what those connection points could be? Do you have any thoughts on that?
Yeah, that's a good question. I think when you think about how God has created us, how God has wired us, we have our different interests. Some people within the church may be very focused on theology, and that could be a good connection point if there's certain opportunities to connect with people who want to just talk theology. There could be other types of interest groups within the church. I think there's so many creative ways to connect people into the church. And so I think it's just a matter of having open discussion about, what are things that people are wanting? What are things that people can be drawn into? And I think that could really be a springboard to a lot of potential for people to connect.
I mean, I guess that's the same for anybody, whether you're on the spectrum or not. But knowing the diagnosis of ASD, are there any things the church could be doing to make the church more accessible to those that are on the spectrum?
Yeah, I would say, there's a variety of different things that can be helpful. Like for one, sensitivities to certain sounds, smells, environments, even things like just the smell of the building, that can be triggering to certain people. It can be very difficult to enter an environment for people who are on the spectrum who have certain sensitivities. So I would say just being aware of that and creating some opportunities for discussion about these things. Like, would it be a possibility, let's say, to have a room where people who are sensitive to sounds, they may want a more quieter place to be able to focus on their relationship with God. So I think the key would be just to really create an environment of inclusivity where people worship and connect to God in different ways. And if we can talk about those ways, and I think that could really help us to bring the body of Christ together.
And I guess it requires a certain sense of felt safety for people to be able to open up to what they actually need. You were talking earlier about having a mask and learning in order to get by in life, not just in the church, but in general. Society sort of places these expectations. In order to function, you have to wear a mask and act neurotypical. And so I'm just wondering, what ways have made you feel safe with other people, one-on-one or in a group? How have you felt safe with others? How do you know when you can drop that mask? How do you know when you can be vulnerable with others and say, you know what, these sounds bother me, or these, if we could do it in a certain way? When do you know you feel comfortable to voice those things out?
I think for me, it would be if I feel like there would be a level of acknowledgement, validation that this is my reality, that these are the challenges that I may have, these are the sensitivities that I may have, and to at least have a sense that the person or the leadership of the church is willing to listen to what I would have to say. So, I think in terms of leadership, church leadership, just to have an openness to hearing from people who are neurodiverse. I know in a previous church, I did see that there were several people who were in that category, and I could tell that it wasn't quite a good fit for them. But the question I asked was, did they have a feeling like they could talk to the leadership, talk about any ideas, talk about how they felt being in the church, just to have your voice heard? I think that would make a big difference, and that could be a very helpful catalyst for change.
And I think it's important to note also that people on the spectrum, it doesn't equate to a cognitive delay or anything like that. There may be some challenges or disabilities attached to it, whether it's like auditory processing or sensory things that they struggle with. But so often, more times than not, people, particularly, it's not a diagnostic, but like high functioning, meaning they're auditory, there's a high cognitive ability, an exceptional cognitive ability that doesn't always get recognized within greater society. You will see things, our son will see things and process things in a higher level often that the typical audience or person you're talking to isn't even thinking. I think of one example of our son who was struggling through childcare, struggling through the Sunday school, because they were just talking about very simplistic Jesus loves me. And all of that was true, except for he was like, it was kind of like he was done with flannelgraph Jesus. He wanted to ask deeper questions on the supremacy of Christ and the flood and creation. And he had deep, complex questions that I would have maybe been asking to my professor in seminary, but he was asking at 4 years old. And I think there's a huge opportunity when we listen to people on the spectrum on what their perspective is, no matter what their IQ is, but to hear a different perspective. There's such beauty in a lot of those perspectives that I don't always think of.
I think that we may sometimes think of people, we stereotype them as, oh, you don't look like that person on Rain Man. Oh, you're not hyper in a certain way. I think that it's important to realize that, there are highly successful people who have neurodiversity, Elon Musk, Bill Gates, people on the Shark's Tank. So we can't just go by how they look. There's a lot more to it than just appearance.
Harold, what about not just having the church be accessible, but what about being able to contribute in the church? Have you found that the church has been able to create space for you to be able to contribute with the giftings that you bring?
This is something I think partially I need to be responsible for in realizing how I'm wired and how I'm able to contribute to the body of Christ. And so, just looking at some of the gifts and how can I use the gifts to grow the church. And so, something like research, like for myself, I really like doing research.
Oh, does he ever?
Yeah, golf balls, golf shafts.
He knows how many divots in the golf ball and what angles they are and what, he researches. It's one of his superpowers.
So things like that. Research is just one of those things. But for myself, like being very methodical and having a desire to do things by the book. And I don't like surprises or changes. So kind of doing more routine things. So I think there's certain things within the church where I feel like I can use those type of abilities. But sometimes, the challenges with the ability to not do so well with social interactions, that can be a challenge. So when you combine, the social interaction challenges and then trying to use your gifts, it can be a challenge. So it has been difficult, but I think that it's not just about the leadership making changes, but also for me to be able to be assertive and state that there are some challenges here, but there are some strengths as well that I can contribute to the body of Christ.
Well, I've seen you light up in the way that you have your counseling practice and interact with other people one-on-one. And as you have helped people for years in the prisons as well, people in very difficult situations, or some people would say I would get too burnt out or too emotionally invested and have compassion fatigue. And yet you were able to day by day routinely get up and face difficult situations and journey through difficult pathways with people in some of the most hopeless situations. And yet I think that was one of your exceptionalities. You were able to show up in ways, and people might think, could somebody on the autism spectrum who has relational difficulties truly help and counsel other people? And yet I see you do it with exceptionality. Can you share a little bit of what it's like to be a psychotherapist in a relational way, working one-on-one with people, and yet facing your own challenges relationally?
I think part of my wiring has helped me to endure the challenges that I face through the interaction with people in the prisons, people going through difficult marriage issues. I think for me, the way that I'm wired, I'm able to have empathy with others, but I still have a level of grounding. And it's hard to say whether it's definitely due to ASD, but I feel like I don't take my work home where it affects me in my home life. Like I've never really felt burnt out in my life. I don't know specifically why, but I feel like wiring probably has something to do with that. But in terms of how do I interact with people, I think that as you grow as an individual, you learn strategies. And, when you go into your master's and your doctorate program, you learn different, counseling techniques and things like that, learning about empathetic statements. And so there are some of those social things that I've been able to pick up over time. Certain situations are still difficult. Like, for example, if I were to go out in public and try to start up a conversation with someone, that would be a little bit challenging, not as much as when I was in high school, for example.
You'd be resting on the couch for sure after that.
Yeah, it does take extra energy. So I can do those things, but there's more going on. It's like an engine that's revving at a higher RPM for me. And so I do get more exhausted. But I think within a counseling environment, I have had the training, I have had the experience where I am able to know, what are the ways to interact with people. I've learned various models. Through my interest in research, I've been able to study different techniques and different things. And so that side of me, that analytical side of me, has given me an ability to process things and to kind of see where things are going. So, for example, when I meet with a client, I'm able to look into, okay, what are the steps that I would need to do to help this person get through, let's say, depression or anxiety. So there's that very methodical, research-based approach that I can use. But I also know, that's something that I learned during my master's program, that I do have a tendency to go to the logical rather than the emotional side with people. And so through that type of feedback, I've had to work on myself to be a helpful counselor, to know that I can't just go to, asking questions about, what do you think about this? What do you think about that? But I need to ask questions like, how does that make you feel? And so that has been something I've learned throughout my career as a counselor.
I'm thinking about the lay pastor, the pastoral teams. How do they effectively pastor those with neurodiversities when they haven't had any special training on how to relate? They haven't had mental health training, or they don't know anything about ASD. Do you have any suggestions of things that they can do to effectively pastor those living with these neurodiversities?
Just thinking about the church, we are a very diverse body. And so it's difficult for a pastor to be on top of everything out there. But in terms of being knowledgeable about things such as trauma or poverty or neurodiversity, I think it's just trying to make an effort to read up on these things. So learning about ADHD, ASD, and really breaking down some of the stereotypes that a pastor may have about these areas, and really looking at stories of people who are going through these challenges, and to just really learn what is it that would be helpful for them in a church environment, and just really being willing to be open to learning. I think that would be the first step. And as a pastor does this, and as they are able to reach out to people who have neurodiversity, that in itself will help those people to feel a greater level of acceptance, and they will feel more welcome in the community. So just having a healthy curiosity about it would be a very helpful step.
Can you think of any practical things that they can do to create that sense of belonging within the whole community? Because they can go study and they can learn about these things themselves, but how do they create that sense of belonging within their whole community?
Yeah, I think there are certain things that can be done. For some people, like myself, I don't like to be a part of a big crowd. And so maybe having a bit more of a one-on-one type of opportunity, if a pastor is able to take some time to reach out to someone one-on-one versus trying to have a big group environment. Because I know the churches can have functions where they do things in large groups, but this may be discouraging or challenging for certain individuals. So maybe just a smaller environment would be helpful, something that would reduce anxieties for people. So, I think there's different things that can be done, but I know that the key thing would be really not to assume what people need, but to ask and see, what would be helpful for a person to really connect with the body.
And I wonder too if it's not necessarily a specific task what to do, but maybe a posture of humility and equality, of a posture of really wanting to listen and learn, not as an other, like you're my mission project and I want to connect with you, but help me to understand. And what is it that makes you light up, and truly get at the same level, I think would go a long way. And I think it takes off some of the pressure for pastors and leaders and just everyday people like myself to not have to have the answers or to say the wrong thing and feel tripped up and paralyzed from saying anything at all or doing anything kind at all to those around me on the spectrum or with other neurodivergents. But to just listen and to say, hey, like to normalize it. Let's make neurodiversity normal. It is normal. It is actually more normal than everybody thinks. There's so many people walking around. I live and walk it all the time, right? And I see it all around me. And I don't go around putting labels on people, but I'm like, wow, this is really Apple and Android. Like it is so much around us. And we often just don't know what we don't know. But if we could just have a posture of humility and just listen and learn and just find ways to connect. There's so many ways that we can connect and be curious, like you said, I think it's an adventure, right? It doesn't have to be getting it right and walking on eggshells. Humility goes a long way.
Yeah, that's right. The pastors don't have to have all the right answers right away. I think it's a learning experience where we journey with people and get to know how they're wired, how they respond to different things, and to be able to work together to see how can I as a pastor help you to grow closer to God in the way that God has wired you.
Harold, I know we're close up for time here, but I would love to pull a thread on what you were just talking about now. In what has caused your relationship with God to grow? I know you have had a mentor that has had a huge impact on how you came to Christ, but how has your relationship with God been nurtured and developed as somebody with autism, connecting relationally with God?
So when I was in my late 20s, I was attending church, and I wasn't really a fully committed Christian at the time, but during that time, they had a mentoring program at the church, and thankfully, I was paired up with my pastor. And so through our regular meetings, he was able to walk with me through life issues. I was going through some challenges, trying to figure out life, trying to figure out what my purpose in life was. And through the one-on-one time that we had every 2 weeks, he was able to bring clarity. He shared insights that really helped me to focus on the giftings that I have and to be able to take risks, to be able to move forward with those giftings. So what it did for me, practically speaking, was it helped me to apply for the counseling program here in the Winnipeg area. And so that was a big step. So without his support, without his encouragement, without the mentoring, I don't know if I would be here today without that. So that's why I believe that mentoring, this one-on-one type of relationship, can really have a huge impact. And I think that with that, that's something that churches can really focus on, to have mentoring as a part of their, I guess, a way of developing Christians.
Some really good insights and stories. Thank you so much, Harold, for everything that you shared today. I know there's a lot of takeaways, a lot of stuff we can chew on, and there's so many more stories to come in this series, Differently Wired in Community, and we're looking forward to more conversations. Thank you so much, Harold.
You're welcome. It's great to be here.
And I know there are wives out there with husbands maybe not even diagnosed, or maybe they are, and moms of children with neurodiversities. I just want to put a shout out to you that reach out to us. Give me your questions. I would love to connect with you. I want to give you hope. I want to say there are so many things in store for you. God has a hope and a future for you, and I am cheering for you, and I would love to hear from you.
So listeners, if you want to respond to any of these episodes, if you have any questions or thoughts, head over to journeywithcare.ca/podcast, and you can share those thoughts. You can leave us a voice message. We would love to hear from you. And hey, we're also looking for sponsorships for the podcast to help keep it going, help spread the message. So if you're a business or if you just want to help support the show, head over to our website and get in touch with us, and we'd be happy to have a conversation with you. Thank you for joining another conversation on Journey with Care, where we inspire curious Canadians on their path of faith and living life with purpose in community. Journey with Care is an initiative of Care Impact, a Canadian charity dedicated to connecting and equipping the whole church to journey well in community. You can visit their website at careimpact.ca or visit journeywithcare.ca to get more information on weekly episodes, Journey with Prayer, and details about our upcoming events and meetups. You can also leave us a message, share your thoughts, and connect with like-minded individuals who are on their own journeys of faith and purpose. Thank you for sharing this podcast and helping these stories reach the community. Together we can explore ways to journey in a good way. And always remember to stay curious.